Thank you very much for joining us for this episode of A Good Show. On this evening's episode, we will commence the investigative series into the COVID-19 vaccination in the Cayman Islands, asking the question, was it safe and effective? Joining us, we have from the United States, Dr. Peter McCullough. Dr. Michael McDowell comes in from Trinidad, and our very own Dr. Tomlinson. Dr. McCullough, would you please introduce yourself for the public's benefit?
It's a pleasure to join this esteemed group. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough, practicing internist, cardiologist, research epidemiologist in Dallas, Texas. I see patients every day in my clinical practice. I'm very involved in academic publication on the pandemic, and I've brought the world the very first multi-drug treatment protocol, McCullough protocol, published in the American Journal of Medicine, and now the first detoxification protocol for patients with long COVID and vaccine injury syndromes, published in the Springer Nature journal. Curious. I have been a public commentator on the pandemic throughout the last 4 years on the major U.S. media, international media. I've testified in the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House of Representatives, European Parliament, Brazilian Chamber, as well as so many houses of governmental leadership around the world. And it's a pleasure to join this group today.
Thank you kindly. Now, Dr. Michael McDowell, please share with us some of your background.
Yes, hi, Kattina. Well, I must say I am not a medical doctor. My doctorate is in theology. I have a PhD in theology, and I'm a senior pastor. I've been a senior pastor I'm the founding and senior pastor of a church called Rapha Revival Ministries for the last 32 years. And I'm also an eschatologist. My specialty in theology is in the area of the end times and the second coming of Christ. And I lecture globally on eschatology. I've touched most of the nations in the world. I think the only area I haven't been to heavily is the European area. But I first became aware of, when I heard that Bill Gates wanted to vaccinate the entire world with an mRNA genetic vaccine, it rang bells in my mind concerning the theology of Genesis 6, verses 1 to 4. And I saw that as another attempt, because an attempt was made in the antediluvian earth to change the genome of the entire human race. So that clued me off, and I began to do a lot of research. I have a background in science. I did biology at McMaster University. So the theology and the biology tied together. And I've been trying to share what my concerns ever since. By the grace of God, I've been able to be in touch with persons like yourself, Kattina, and of course the esteemed Dr. McCullough, and now of course Dr. Tomlinson. So it's a joy to be here.
Thank you. Stranger to the Cayman population, our very own Dr. Tomlinson, please.
Yeah, well, hello. I'm certainly very privileged to be in this discussion this evening. I am Dr. Steve Tomlinson, like you said, no stranger to the general public here in the Cayman Islands. I'm a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, and I've been in medical practice for the past 52 years. And I've really enjoyed my practice. I graduated from the University of the West Indies with my basic medical degree, and thereafter went to the United Kingdom, where I did my surgery. I was there for quite a number of years, and finally acquired the fellowship of the Royal College of Surgeons, Glasgow. And after that, I had various stints in different countries, and eventually came home. And I've been home since 1979. Of course, I continue to get my continuing medical education. I'm a member of the Saudi Surgical Congress. In fact, I was there in Clearwater only about 2 weeks ago, and was quite refreshing to see some of my older colleagues. I've enjoyed my practice, and like the two other esteemed doctors, I have been very concerned from the very inception about the vaccination program throughout. It seems like the whole world, it's an attempt to vaccinate the whole world. Cayman being no exception. And I had my own concerns about the vaccination. And of course, we were concerned about COVID also. But from the beginning, I felt that we had to be very careful with this vaccination. And I had various reports coming in from other doctors and also some societies in different countries. I kept open throughout the campaign, throughout the vaccination campaign in the Cayman Islands. I decided that I would stay open. I was one of the few doctors that remained open throughout the pandemic. And I'm glad I remained open because I must give credit to the government here. They didn't really stop me from using some of the medications that I felt would help people who had developed COVID. So in that, I was very, very fortunate. And I ended up treating thousands of Caymanians, and none of them died. And only one or two ended up having to go to the hospital. And thankfully, they did not die. So I'm happy that I was here during that period and had the privilege of treating so many people. I've kept an accurate record of that and plan to do a paper on that eventually. In fact, I've begun, and hopefully it'll be completed within the next 6 months, and I plan to put that into the West Indian Journal of Medicine. Nice being here with you all, and I look forward to this entire meeting.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tomlinson. So it seems like we need to schedule you in for another episode of A Good Show in just over 6 months' time, so that you can talk about the paper that you have written and your statistics in more depth and share with us some of your findings right here in the Cayman Islands. Thank you. Now, for our viewing audience, here's a little more insight for you about what this show is all about. This is an investigative series titled COVID-19 Vaccination in the Cayman Islands. Was it safe and effective? It is an interactive panel discussion on the COVID-19 vaccination program in the Cayman Islands, comparing the available Cayman Island statistics to those in the region and globally, thereby assessing the safeness and effectiveness of the COVID-19 vaccine and evaluating the benefits of the vaccination program in the Cayman Islands. This investigative series is being brought to you by the Christian Association, the producers of A Good Show. I am your moderator this afternoon, and I tender apologies for Pastor Peguero, who is usually with me on these events, but is about her pastoral duties this afternoon. And so I am honored to be here with you nonetheless. So thank you all very much for tuning in to A Good Show. Now, I think a good place for us to start in the foundation of this is dealing with some of the definitions and protocols that is normally found in the medical field. Because if we're going to properly assess it, we need to be assessing it against something. And that something is the medical ethics and the procedures, the procedures that goes along with clinical trials for vaccination programs and so on. Dr. McCullough, would you care to explain to us what informed consent really means? What its definition is?
Informed consent is considered a cornerstone of clinical care and biomedical research. In fact, it's memorialized in the Declaration of Helsinki. But informed consent means that the participant, the patient who's going to receive care, under no circumstances receives any pressure, coercion, or threat of reprisal for either receiving or not receiving the therapy or participating in the research. It means that they fully understand the risks, both the known risks and the theoretical risks of the treatment or the vaccine, and that they can weigh that against the theoretical benefits of the vaccine applied. And I think our group will deliberate this, but I can tell you the COVID-19 vaccines initially only had 2 months of observation on treatment and then another month of follow-up from the initial series. So no one was fully informed of what the longer term safety or efficacy data would ever show. The trials were simply too short to provide full informed consent. Once somebody took the vaccine, no one would know what would happen 6 months later.
Yes. So, Doctor, either any of you actually can speak to this. The mode for clinical trials sometimes can take a decade, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years in order to get a vaccine through to FDA approval if it follows the right procedure. Are you able to elaborate on what that procedure is? Or give us some insight about how it is, the process it goes through.
But before Dr. Tomlinson takes this, because this is not really in my field, but let me just mention that what alarmed me most of all was the fact that there was something called Operation Warp Speed launched for the production of the vaccines. And I think the general public was alarmed by the fact that vaccines could be rushed through so quickly, knowing that it takes years to perfect the vaccine and to get everything right. And the rush was very alarming to most people. And so right from the onset, there were questions about the efficacy and safety of the vaccine. So I defer to Dr. Tomlinson.
Now, Kattina,
Yes.
whenever there's a new drug or even equipment in medicine that is instigated, are you hearing me?
Yes, we are, Dr. Tomlinson.
There is normally a process that has to be gone through. Number one, of course, you have to have participants and so on, and often you have to advertise and see if anyone would like to join the research that's being conducted. And it has to be explained to them properly. As Dr. McCullough said, what are the risks, if any, is known. At that point, the majority of people, for example, if it's a drug to treat cancer, the majority of people who participate, the majority of times they have gone through, they've tried various treatments that are currently available. And perhaps as a last resort, quite often they decide, well, since I'm in this position, I may as well try and be part of this trial. And of course, they have to do this voluntarily. And often the investigator that's conducting such research, says clearly that if something happens to the individual, that everyone will do their very best to help the person. Sometimes people, of course, end up having side effects from the drugs, and worse than that, some people are permanently harmed. And all of these things are taken into account. And at any rate, the individual is in some way compensated. And there are various stages of research. And finally, the various stages have to be gone through. One, at the beginning, the research is conducted principally on animals first, and if they don't have any untoward side effects, then small groups of people are invited to participate. And if they don't have too many adverse side effects, then larger groups and sometimes multi-center trials, meaning that it's not just one center that's conducting the trial, but different centers in different parts of the world or even in a specific country, they're also participating in the trial. And finally, the research is presented, and not final. In the final stages, of course, it is presented, and even as the research progresses, it is presented. In the case of the United States, say to the FDA, and depending on the body that oversees research, in the United Kingdom, it's MHRH, and here in the Cayman Islands, of course, it would be the Health Practice Commission. So, at the end of the day, the research is either approved in that the researchers are given a marketing license. The important thing to know is that this doesn't take a day or two or even a year. The majority of time this goes on for many years, and this was not the case, as you know, with the vaccines. And I agree with Dr. McCullough. There was some concern because of how fast the vaccines were produced. But what I must say is that I know as a fact that the actual technology was known long before the warp speed began. Dr. McCullough might like to elaborate on that later on. But definitely it didn't go through the trials as normally one would have expected. Does that answer your question? I hope it at least throws a little light on it.
It does, and I think that the viewing public certainly appreciated your explanation of how vaccines are tested and proven, and how the engagement with the human being is actually deployed. So these protocols are actually a result of the Nuremberg trials, which brought us the Nuremberg Code because of what happened back in Nazi Germany. And I'm sure to put the word Nazi in because not every German was a Nazi, and not every German agreed with what was happening in the Holocaust, and so that distinction needs to be made that it was a Nazism that was happening in Germany, and so the Nuremberg, I think it started with the T4 program back in 1936, which was a Hitler orchestrated program, and it did testing on euthanasia of the elderly, disabled, in other words, the useless eaters. And as a result of that medical scientific experimentation and the Holocaust itself and all of what happened during the Holocaust, following the end of the Second World War, we had the Nuremberg trials, and the Nuremberg trials caused what is now known in the medical industry to have the Nuremberg Code created. And it is this Nuremberg Code that sets the principles for medical procedures. Is that correct? Thank you. Now, a part of what came out also from as a result of the Second World War was the creation of the United Nations and its Charter on Fundamental Freedoms and Rights, and the responsibilities of government towards its citizens. And at Article 4 of the ICCPR, we have where individuals cannot be subjected without his free consent to medical or scientific experimentation. Now, we can say, my apologies, we can say that I think it can be agreed that the COVID-19 vaccination being deployed in the way that it was globally, and with the warp speed that it was deployed, having not gone through the proper testing protocols as you set out, Dr. Tomlinson, and as agreed by Dr. McCullough, it was a medical experiment. Your thoughts on that?
It definitely was an experiment, and they only got a license for experimental use, as you know, in the beginning.
Dr. McCullough, can you speak to some of the Emergency Use Act. Can you speak to some? Thank you.
Most of the world actually followed the regulatory guidance of the United States, and I imagine Cayman is no different. So the U.S. FDA set the standard. Now there is a regulatory procedure called emergency use authorization. It had been used about a dozen times previously, but exclusively for the U.S. military for various products, including the anthrax vaccine. Emergency use authorization had never been used for a public product. And what it says is that if there is no other alternative and there is a national emergency, which there was declared by former President Trump, and there's a public health emergency declared by our Health and Human Services Director, that in fact this regulatory pathway could be invoked. A product could be emergency use authorized. So in the United States, all the products, starting with remdesivir and then bamlanivimab and then the vaccines, were all emergency use authorized. And what that meant is they skipped a lot of key regulatory steps. We had no idea if these were going to work or not going to work. But there's nothing in the regulatory law that says that people have to take it. This is very important. And when these vaccines were rolled out, they weren't rolled out with risk stratification. What should have happened, even in the most dire circumstances, only those at high risk for hospitalization and death should have ever been offered a vaccine. But what we saw happen was just the opposite. There was quickly a focus on young people, those who had no threat of having hospitalization and death, patients who already had the illness and could have no benefit from a vaccine. They were offered the vaccine and then shortly after that forced into it. And then sadly, we saw pregnant women and children. So the emergency use authorization for the first time for public use turned out to be a disaster.
Now, Dr. McDowell, is that what Dr. McCullough was seeing in the United States? Was that pretty much what you were observing over in Trinidad as well?
Yes, I believe so. You know, one of the things that Dr. McCullough just said that really impressed me, touched me, was that the EUA, the Emergency Use Authorization, was done exclusively for the military, first of all, and was never used publicly. And I heard of a gentleman by the name of Dr. Gerd van den Bosch. He's a vaccinologist, worked with Gavi and a number of the top vaccinologist companies. And one of the things he said very early on was that mass vaccination during a pandemic or mass vaccination at a time of high infectious pressure is a prescription for catastrophe. And he warned the world very, very early at the inception of the vaccine being introduced, that and he published a number of papers on this, Dr. Gerd van den Bosch, that what the world was doing was really the complete antithesis of proper medical practice. So mass vaccination was rolled out, and one of the things we noted in Trinidad and Tobago very early as well was that when mass vaccination was rolled out, I think it was on April 6th, if I remember, 2021, our vaccination campaign started. Within 2 weeks of the rollout of that mass vaccination campaign, the graph in Trinidad and Tobago, the graph of deaths in Trinidad and Tobago spiked precipitously, went up with a very steep incline and never stopped. And when you examine the global statistics and the graphs from all around the world, it was also found that as soon as the different countries rolled out the vaccination at different times. I think the US rolled out their vaccination in December 2020, and the other nations followed suit. And by around March or April 2021, the whole world had rolled out their vaccination program. But whenever that vaccination program was rolled out, within 2 weeks of the rollout of the vaccination program, the death graph spiked precipitously upward. And in our own country, there were lots of graphs shown on the television about what's happening with the vaccination and COVID-19, but no graph showed the spike in deaths that took place after the vaccination rollout. A very, very simple graph, but they went to all sorts of complicated graphs to show us different things. But they never showed us the death spike that took place, which is obviously correlates the vaccine to the increased rate of death.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Tomlinson, you spoke just now about having treated so many people here in Cayman after the vaccination program. Were your observations similar to those of Dr. McCullough and Dr. McDowell?
The vaccination that was given here, I think, was the Pfizer vaccine, and it became available. That was in early 2021. I believe that is when they started vaccinating people. And of course, I won't go into many of the things that I disagreed with from the very beginning, but definitely after the vaccination started, this is when we were seeing it long after that they opened up. And when they opened up the borders, if you remember, that was when there was a big spike in actual cases here in Cayman. The death rate here, that's something that I'm waiting for statistics. We know that for the year 2021, 2022, and even 2023, there has been an increase in the Cayman Islands rate, and those statistics will soon be available. I can't say at this point whether there was a big spike immediately after the rollout of the vaccine and deaths. That's something that I'm waiting myself to find out more about here in the Cayman Islands. We know we had over 20. It was just over 20 deaths here in the Cayman Islands. So one of the things that concern me, though, Kattina, is that I'm very concerned about the ongoing increase in death rate here in the Cayman Islands. I mean, just Saturday gone, we buried a 32-year-old man because he had a heart attack. And I think this is something that people need to be looking at. Why is it that so many of the younger people are dying? And this wasn't how it was in Cayman in the past. Something has happened. Why we're seeing younger people dying mainly of heart problems. It's definitely a problem, and it seems like not a lot of people are looking into it. I'm glad that you're one of that's certainly very concerned, and there are definitely other people I know that are concerned. We need to take a special. I think we need to really be looking not just in the increase in the death rate, but the ages. You know, who is it that is dying, that's causing this increase in death rate, and you know, what is really causing their death. So that's something that I'm very interested in, because it's definite. It's not anecdotal anymore. There is definitely an increase in deaths among the younger population. And like I said, one of the main problems that cause their death is related to the heart.
Well, with having said that, I think that is a good place for us to stop for right now for this episode of A Good Show. Thank you so very much for staying tuned to A Good Show. You have just watched part 1 of COVID-19 vaccination in the Cayman Islands. Was it safe and effective? Join us again next Sunday for part 2 of COVID-19 vaccination in the Cayman Islands. Was it safe and effective on A Good Show? You can watch A Good Show on Sundays and Tuesdays at 7 p.m. on Cayman Live TV, channel 33 on Logic. Thank you, and God bless you.
A Good Show is brought to you by the kind donations of private sponsors like yourselves and the support of companies such as Media Warehouse, 7 Miles of Grace, H. Philippi Bank's Attorney at Law, Dragonfly Cayman, and others. To become a sponsor, an advertiser, or to make a donation, email agoodshow@christian.ky.